გერმანიის საჯარო პალატის გენერალური მდივანი და იგი დღეს ჩვენ გვესაუბრება უკრაინის კრიზისზე და ამ კრიზისის გავლენაზე ევროპულ ეკონომიკაზე. ალბათ ძალიან საინტერესო მოვისმინოთ გერმანიის წარმომადგენლის პოზიცია შეხედულებები ამ საკითხებთან მიმართებაში. მე აღარ გავახსენებ საუბარს. პრინციპში ვიტყვი მხოლოდ იმას, რომ ატლანტიკური საბჭო არის ამ ორგანიზებების ერთ-ერთი ორგანიზატორი. გენერალურის ფონდი ზოგადად ამ ჩვენი ნახსენები დიალოგის ერთ-ერთი პარტნიორთან მხარდამჭერი, ეს ფონდი მნიშვნელოვანი პარტნიორია ჩვენი უნივერსიტეტისაც. მათ მინდა დიდი მადლობა უთხრა. ბატონი ხელი არის წარმომადგენელი ატლანტიკური საბჭოსი და მოდერაციას საგენერალური შეხვედრისას ის მოაკეთეთ. კიდევ ერთხელ დროში ვარ შესაძლებელი, ამიტომ როდესაც კითხვა-პასუხის რეჟიმზე გადავალ, ძალიან მოგხონ ძალიან პატივით ზეთრებს მათთვის დროს.
დიდი მადლობა. პირველ რიგში ბატონ ვიეკს და ატლანტიკური საბჭოს და გენერალურის კონთან ერთობლივი ორგანიზებით ილიას სახელმწიფო უნივერსიტეტში ასეთ შეხვედრას. ეს არის ძალზედ საინტერესო შესაძლებლობა ჩვენთვის, რომ მოვისმინოთ პერსპექტივა ზოგადად ქართულ-გერმანული ურთიერთობების, ოღონდ არა პოლიტიკური ჭრილით, არამედ ბიზნეს ეკონომიკური ჭრილით და როგორც მოგეხსენებათ, ბიზნეს ეკონომიკა სავაჭრო ურთიერთობებს იმ პირობებში, როდესაც საქართველოს ცდილობს გახდეს ევროპული თანამეგობრობის სრულუფლებიანი წევრი, როდესაც ჩვენი ამბიცია არის, რომ სწორედ ის ვერკეტები, რომელიც დღეს ჩვენ გაგვაჩნია, ეს არის ყურადღება და ყოველწლიურად თავისუფალი ვაჭრობა თუ მოვიზო მიმოსვლა, როგორ შეიძლება გარდაისახოს იმ ეკონომიკურ პოტენციალში, რომელიც თანხმედრაში იქნება გერმანიის ევროპის წამყვანი სახელმწიფოს ეკონომიკურ თუ სტრატეგიულ ინტერესებთან. აქედან გამომდინარე, ბატონი ვიეკის გამოცდილება, იგი ამჟამად როგორც ბატონმა დავით აფრასიძემ მოგახსენათ, არის საერთაშორისო კომერციული International Chamber of Commerce's პრეზიდენტი და მანამდე მნიშვნელოვანი პოზიციები ეჭირა ასეთი ტიპის გერმანიის საგარეო ვაჭრობის ორგანიზაციაში და მისი ხედვა და მისი მიერ მოწოდებული ინფორმაცია იქნება ძალზე მნიშვნელოვანი როგორც სტუდენტებისათვის, ვინც ამ საკითხებით არის დაკავშირებული, ასევე არასამთავრობო სექტორისათვის და ქართული საქართველოს კერძო ბიზნესისთვისაც. ვთვლი რომ ეს სტრატეგიულად მნიშვნელოვანი არის ჩვენი ქვეყნისთვის და ზედმეტი დაახლოების გარეშე მინდა ბატონ ვიეკს კიდევ ერთხელ მადლობა მოუხადო და გადავცეს სიტყვა. მისი სიტყვის შემდეგ უკვე გვექნება შესაძლებლობა კითხვა-პასუხისთვის.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm sure that the first two speakers were absolutely right in what they're saying, except for the fact that I didn't really understand. But I hope you know at least who I am. I'm the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, which is located in Paris, and there are about 80 national committees, and I'm heading the National Committee in Germany. And before I was working for the Federation of German Industries, the business organization in Germany, and before that I was responsible for the Committee on Eastern European Economic Relations, Ostausschuss der deutschen Wirtschaft, also an organization which was and still is heavily engaged in this region, Russia, South Caucasus, Ukraine, Southeastern Europe. Thank you again to the Council to invite me to today's event and for the possibility to present my views on the crisis of the Ukraine and its impact on the European economy. When speaking about the economic effects, you can either speak about the crisis within the Ukrainian markets and the effects this might have on the European economy. And I would say it isn't too far-reaching to say that these effects are, to say the least, meager. And by saying that, I want to emphasize that I'm not underestimating the effects of this crisis on the Ukrainian people themselves, but that is not the issue we are talking about. Or, when speaking about the economic effects, we can and should discuss about the sanctions against Russia. That is what I'm going to do, and I want to start by saying that it's for no one too big a surprise that the sanctions of the EU against Russia will be extended beyond this year. And as far as I'm informed, there's already an agreement between the 28 EU members on this extension, at least until the end of this year. Most EU members state that the states even go a step further. The lifting of the sanctions should only be possible if Russia returns the peninsula of Crimea back to the Ukraine. The current sanctions regime includes restrictions on trade with Russia, on defense, financial, and the energy sector. At the end of last year, the European Commission presented a first overview of the impact of these measures, which were imposed late July and early September 2014. According to the Commission, the hit of the sanctions to the EU's economy is expected to remain contained. The Commission estimates for this year that EU sanctions will reduce the EU's economic growth by 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points. These figures seem to contrast estimates in Germany, where last year exports to Russia fell by some 17%. But the overall impact of this decline on German trade remains small. Exports to Russia account only for 3.3% of our total exports in goods and services of last year. So also, although some companies, particularly in the food industry, may suffer due to their heavy engagement in Russia more, the impact on the overall economy remains small. Experts even expect an annual growth in Germany, total overall growth of something around 2%. With regard to Russia, the Commission estimates that the growth rate will be cut by 1.1 percentage points, and worse. Capital outflows from Russia, which already hit 110 billion euro last year, will further increase during this year. And if this had not been enough, the Commission also estimates that Russian countermeasures against the EU, including banning many food imports, place serious pressure on Russia's own farmers. Therefore, the recent demission of the Minister of Agriculture is not a real surprise. In short, the sanctions introduced in July and September 2014 are painful for Russia, and their impact on the Russian economy will increase during the course of this year. Ladies and gentlemen, I could stop here now and open the discussion on the figures I just presented, but I think that would be far too simplistic. The reason is that I strongly believe that the impact of the crisis in the Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia reach far beyond the growing or shrinking of economies. Let me explain to you what I mean. For the last few decades, Western powers benefited from an international architecture that was designed and policed by themselves. And although rising powers such as Brazil, China, India, and definitely also Russia, have not yet overturned these post-war institutions, they are uncomfortable with the way the West has used the global institutions to pursue its own interests. If the West now tries to turn these institutions against Russia, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, it may find that it encourages revisionism rather than deterring it. So even if the crisis up to now has been contained to Ukraine, what will the longer-term global consequences of the Ukrainian crisis be? I will present 5 findings we might want to discuss afterwards. First finding I want to call weaponizing the legal order. Since the end of the Cold War, the world has benefited from 2 orders. On the one hand, the American-led security power that ensured a balance of power in every region. On the other hand, a European-led legalistic approach that sought to write rules for our independent world, in everything from free trade and climate emissions to financial transactions and so on. With the US recalibration of its own foreign policy, the West now seems to be trying to compensate its unwillingness to use military power by weaponizing the international legal order. That is, using economic, financial sanctions, asset freezes, and other economic means to minimize the choices of revisionist power. Second finding, which I want to sum up as raising the stakes in Russia. The annexation of Crimea has dramatically intensified internal political and economic strains that Putin's authoritarian regime was already facing before the sanctions were imposed. It thus created a domestic pressure which may relatively quickly spawn either full-fledged authoritarianism or the collapse of the regime. The exact outcome remains anyone's guess for now. Third finding. Russia is openly challenging the European order. By annexing Crimea and intervening in Ukraine, Russia has raised fundamental questions about the principles of the European order. And this cannot be a surprise. Russia was always against the principle that countries are free to choose their alliances and has consistently tried to derail NATO enlargement into its own neighborhood. What Russia wants is both to restore and legitimize spheres of influence as a fundamental principle of European order. This is a direct challenge to Europe and the West as a whole, and whatever diplomats are trying to tell us, it is more than unlikely that Russia will return to the Western-led order. Fourth finding I want to put under the headline, the West loses the rest. Despite the fact that Russia's use of force to annex territory set a precedent, the world has not taken the West's side. The large number of abstentions in the UN General Assembly vote shows that many countries see the annexation of Crimea rather as a regional struggle than as a fundamental question of international order. And it is more than that. Non-Western countries do not accept anymore the Western's self-identification as the guardian of liberal order. And on top comes the strong conviction that the West enjoys an unjustified position of privilege in the international system which should not be supported. In the specific case of the annexation of the Crimea, this behavior is even more surprising because many of these countries worry about their own secessionist movement. You would think that these countries would therefore heavily oppose Russia's annexation. But these countries seem to worry even more about Western intervention. And this includes India, which would worry about any referendum on secession because of the Kashmir issue, and especially China, which sees a chance of enlisting Russia in its own territorial boundaries. My fifth and last finding, and then here I'm coming back to economics, is looking for energy. No one will be surprised that any European strategy to reduce energy dependence on Russia will inevitably turn its attention to the Middle East. Alongside existing sources in Algeria and the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Ukraine crisis could make the sanctioned Iran energy market look even more attractive. Iran, as a potential energy supplier, would rather encourage Russian-Iranian competition as opposed to Russian-Iranian cooperation. Europe might also refocus attention on Libya to see new opportunities in the Kurdish or other regions of Iraq. But prospects for a serious Middle East energy pivot may prove also elusive as they are tantalizing. They should be on Europeans' radar. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm quite aware that some, if not all, of my findings are debatable, and this is exactly the reason why I'm presenting them today on this occasion. Thank you once again for the invitation and for your attention. I'm more than open to discuss and to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I will turn to English language, so to save time and have our discussion more efficient and engaging. Thank you, Mr. Wick, for your well-structured presentation, which is really thought-provoking, particularly putting the economic or business dimension of European cooperation in a broader geopolitical context. And whatever happens in our part of the world, there might be different views, whether it's a regional problem or it's a more global change of world order or legal order. As we, and if you ask any Georgian, the recent historical memory of geopolitical changes in the post-Soviet space very closely resembles what is happening in Ukraine now. So whether we will consider this as the regional struggle or Russia's struggle for their sphere of influence or Russia's phantom pain because of dissolution of the Soviet Union, still this region, post-Soviet space, has already evolved to the stage where ambition to claim to be part of the European family is way much more relevant than initial phase of the Soviet Union dissolution. Of course, different countries of the Eastern European Partnership have different democratic or statehood credentials, but in general, this is the path that most of let's say scholars think that the irreversible path. So I will take the liberty of asking a first question, and then we will collect questions from the audience as well. My question is, having in mind the dynamics of geopolitical changes in post-Soviet space since early 90s, what's your observation since you've been observing this process from the business community or economy and trade side of the same token? How this affected throughout these 25 years the German strategic interest or interest of the German business community?
Okay, that would be then another speech for another half an hour, but to make it short, what happened when the Cold War ended and the wall was torn down was that suddenly a very long time existing market opened even more than it was during the Cold War. For German business, and here I'm particularly mentioning the small and medium-sized enterprises, this new chance in a very close-by market was a huge opportunity. I wouldn't say they flooded into the East, but somehow the whole attention of German business was directed into the eastern part of Europe, and rightly so. It is and was, I wouldn't call it a home turf, but geographically close, huge markets, increasing demands, good reputation of at least West German technology, and therefore I think if there is one country or one economy which definitely benefited from the opening up of Eastern Europe, then it was the German economy. Well, I can stop here and we come back to the crisis, but I think on the fundamentals, this crisis hasn't really changed too much. I just mentioned the figures. There is this decrease. This has happened before. This had happened in 2008 when we had the financial crisis. I'm hopeful that this downturn will not be a constant downturn, but definitely under the new geopolitical situation, the relation with Russia, not only our bilateral relation, but also the relation to many neighbors of Russia to Russia and vice versa, has definitely changed, and this process is going to continue, and the end hasn't yet been seen.
Thank you very much. Now, the floor is open for the questions from the audience. Please. And mic will be available as well.
Dr. from Atlantic. Thank you for, I would say, excellent, truly excellent presentation. I would be happy if you could just write it as an op-ed. It would be really very educational and eye-opening. So my question is that, from your perspective, if we look on the European security issue, so there are the issues that must be dealt in the short term, and then there are the issues that may must be sought in the long term. So could you just give us a little bit of perspective? How do you see, I mean, you put this interesting issue with the containment versus revisionism. So what is encouraging revisionism and what is encouraging or how to contain Russia? But how do you see Europe 10 years from now? So it's really difficult question, but well, I understand that in long term we all are dead. But still, I mean, unless we have at least some kind of vision for the future, we can't get there.
I hope you don't want me to speak about enlargement now, but talking about foreign security policy, as you are aware, this is not my home turf. I like to talk and I like to discuss about it, and I also think that the question is rightly posed. What I would like the European Union in 10 years to be is definitely in a better position to react to geopolitical challenges as they are right now. You know where the European Union comes from, you know what their basic ideas were when it was founded, and foreign and security dimension didn't play a too important role. But I think, and this is not only since the Ukrainian crisis, but already long before, it is obvious, or it was obvious, that this concentration on purely economic effects and reasonings are long gone. And the big challenge and the big question is how to organize the European process, also in the foreign and security policy, where every country's individual past can be a part of it. And there you definitely have to look into the German history, you have to look into the foreign policies of important countries such as France and Great Britain, as long as it is still and hopefully will be part of the EU, which all had their own and have their own foreign policies, their own security policies, and to put a European denominator on top of it is very challenging. There has been improvements in the past, without going too much into the details, and I think the best we can hope for the next 10 years that Europe can achieve to speak more and more with one voice, to react quickly to challenges as Russia for the time being poses on the EU, and not to let itself be torn apart, even if you have some economic challenges now, and even if you're desperately looking for new funds, this should, I think, not prevail and should not lead to a separation of, let's say, the principal European foreign policy. That is very challenging because we are a Europe of individual nations which continue with their own foreign policies and their own foreign relations. But I think that would be worth aiming at. And I think if you want to, in the end, that's what I at least hope for the next 10 years, that Europe is also regarded as not only a single market, but also a single voice in foreign security policy.
Thank you. Some questions? Please, microphone to you.
Thank you very much. Today, representing the civil society, which is always very concerned with the crisis in Ukraine because of its direct implications to Georgia's future. My question is, if I understood you correctly, one of your findings was that Russia is unlikely to return to the Western-led order. What are those sanctions all about? What's going to be the implication of those sanctions or impact of the sanctions on Russia's future behavior patterns. That's what I would be interested in.
Well, could someone from a business organization be asked any better question than this one? Because that raises the question of the effectiveness of sanctions, of economic sanctions as such. And as you might already have guessed, that my or business relation to these kind of weaponizing the legal system is an ambiguous one. I think we all accept and see that the sanctions have an economic effect on the Russian economy, as I was demonstrating with the figures, and I think this effect will continue. For Russia and even beyond energy, European is too important economic market as this couldn't have any effect. But that is not the reason why you impose sanctions. Of course, you want to hit someone with this, but you also want to change someone's behavior. And there, I really have to say, no matter where you look, and no matter which country you take, that economic sanctions really lead to a change of foreign or security policy. I mean, I see only very little showcases that this really happened in the past. So there is a big reluctancy within the German business community if this is the right way. But as I tried to make clear in my presentation, this seems to be the latest way of doing politics because on the other side, and that is something I think no one wants, using military force in a conflict like that would definitely be the wrong response and definitely not change anything either. So I think we are still in the situation that we can hurt Russia, and by hurting Russia, trying to bring them back to the negotiating table. As it worked out, this I have to admit with Iran, which suffered heavily, not so much on the general economic sanctions, but particularly on the financial transaction sanctions. Can you compare Iran with Russia? As a permanent member of the Security Council, the size Russia has, the self-conscience Russia has, I'm not sure. I'm also having quite some knowledge about the Russian economy. I'm also quite convinced that their outreach to China or to Asia will not prevail, that they are not ready at all for such an outreach, that they are, what they can do is supply energy, but nothing else. Still, let's bring Russia back to the table. I'm doubtful.
I won't get up if you don't mind. I'm much of them for opposed to research. I just want to, in retrospect, go back where the whole conflict with Ukraine started. And when I was in Vilnius with the Georgian president, it was very clear that when we were signing the association agreement, Moscow made it very clear that this is big no for them, and the whole idea of association of Ukraine with Europe and free trade agreement was a problem because of the Eurasian Union and all their plans for former Soviet republics. And the war started basically, according to Russians, because of Ukraine's decision to say no to Eurasian Union and go towards European Union association, etc. So clearly we mentioned two dimensions, a couple of dimensions. One is important dimension is about Russia privilege zone of influences, and that's the kind of reality, so-called, they like to say new reality. They would like to establish there is a European reality and Eurasian reality, and all the former Soviet republics who have European aspirations should be part of it. And obviously here, sitting in Georgia, very clearly we have two major kind of understanding how we and why we signed the association agreement. It's on two levels, on bilateral levels, to work with European nations to establish trade, economic relations, and obviously, the CFTA allows you to work with European partners and access European market. And obviously, the second part of because where we are, energy is important. We are a major transit country, and there are new projects in pipeline. The Europeans, the Americans, and others, in addition to BTC, etc., are interested in working. But you mentioned also in your presentation, you see some kind of hesitance, kind of lack of interest, or the fear from German, European, or other companies because of Russia's clear sign of not to do business with Ukrainian, Georgian, and other companies because of their area of influence, not to engage in this part of the world. Is that the kind of the future we might have? Because we clearly see some kind of pessimism that how will whole geopolitics in the region will develop. And wherever geopolitics is not great, companies are very cautious. Do you see, what's your perspective, what's your understanding on how this CFTA with Georgia and Ukraine will go on from European perspective, and how much American, for example, input you see here there, and they understand that they need to be part of the whole picture, not to let Europeans just deal with Russia and Ukraine and Georgia to try to re-establish good relations with Russia, which is almost impossible right now. What are your understanding prospects for Georgia, Ukraine to engage through this CFTA with European companies, European economies, and energy? How much do you think that Georgia might play a bigger role when it comes to Caspian or Iranian energy transit to European markets? Thank you.
Well, also a lot of questions, but to start with, it doesn't come as a surprise that for business is important. Business is there where the opportunities are, and beyond all crises or all problems, the biggest market in the region, Eastern Europe or Asia, is definitely the Russian market. Therefore, it cannot be a surprise that the German business is very much interested in their economic ties, their economic relations with Russia continue. Although we are now in heavy water, and although the political and security relations are difficult. By saying that, I also want to make a clear statement that whatever politicians, the EU, the national government decide concerning sanctions, they will be followed by German companies. But as was just questioned, you can also question these sanctions, the effects of these sanctions, at least when you follow political goals. So having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean that that you let yourself, how should I say, instrumentalized by the Russian government concerning our economic relations with other countries in the region. Every company, be it in the time before the crisis or in the crisis or after the crisis, has always to make up their mind where and how and for how long they want to engage. And therefore, my feeling, at least my impression I have, without really having all the latest and actual news on it, is not that there is Russian interfering into our economic relations with Ukraine, Georgia, or Moldova, but that the challenge, I think, particularly for Georgia, for Ukraine later on, and also for Moldova, is more that preparing its own economy, but I would even go a step further, also preparing their own society for, let's say, the European acquis, the European culture, the European thinking. And in doing so, you definitely will, in the end, face a huger market for your own products. But what you will also face, and for that you have to prepare yourself, or the Georgian industry or business, that you're also facing more competition. So my strong advice for the Georgian side would be to say, yes, take it as a chance, but also use this time, this transition period, to prepare your own companies, to improve your own competitiveness, to be better prepared for what then comes if the markets then really open. And this can only be a two-side approach, and there I think, particularly in the former Soviet countries, the challenges are still huge, because you were having a completely different past. You were coming from a completely different economic system, from a far more planified structure and economic system. And the way, this can be clearly seen in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, the way to let's say, a full-fledged single market or free trade zone, whatever you want to call it, is long. And it is long particularly for an economy such as the Georgian economy. So my point, to make it short, isn't so much we are turning away from these countries. My point is more to say, well, there are huge opportunities, there are huge chances, but prepare yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Regarding the Ukrainian conflict, can we suggest debt restructuring as a way of solution of the conflict? And how can EU take role in this process? Thank you very much.
You mean debt restructuring of Ukraine?
Yeah, with debt with Ukraine to Russia, I mean this step.
Well, I'm not a finance expert, but even if you restructure the debt, the challenge will still remain is how do you improve your competitiveness? And I agree, you have then hopefully the additional funds you get and you have will then be used for improving the competitiveness of the economy. But before doing so, you have to implement economic reforms. So the pure concentration on debt restructuring, in my mind, will not be too helpful, and the best example being Greece. You have to impose heavy and hurting reforms to also change the mentality, to improve the competitiveness, and to prepare these companies for a highly demanding, highly competitive European market. And only debt restructuring, in my mind, is only one part of the whole story.
Question over there.
If I may, Georg Michel, the Atlantic Council. If you were to advise German companies about the investment in Georgia, I'm not talking about the strategic things, the energy corridors and that sort of things, but to advise, let's say, small to medium to large German companies to invest in Georgia, what kind of the arguments you would provide for it? And if not, what kind of arguments you would say that, what kind of negative arguments you would propose? Thank you.
Lucky me that I'm no longer the Director General of the Ostdeutsche Deutsche Wirtschaft, who would now really have to go into details to answer the question. But I would like to turn the question around and would propose to the Georgian business community and the government to try to develop your individual selling points, to develop the economic advantages which Georgia definitely has. And then trying to market, to develop a marketing around these advantages you have. And from a broader view, not specifically with regard to Georgia, I think what is always tantalizing for business is definitely the size of the market. Okay, that's not so much true for Georgia, but then look for partners, look for common markets. Okay, the perspective is the EU, but until then, and again, this would be a good argument. The second thing is to say, if you don't have a market in yourself, then develop yourself as a hub to other markets. Just leave it as that, without going too much into details. And then if you look at the, you said the big infrastructure deals, we all know what we are talking about, and these might also be of interest, but this is for me then less a question of Georgia only, but it's then again more a question about the whole region and where does the energy come from, where does it flow to. But then also the question is, where do you see the particular advantages of the Georgian industry, of the Georgian economy? Where are the economies of scale so interesting for foreign investors that they would definitely go there? Because again, in this area of foreign direct investment, the competition is high and money is shy like a deer. So it goes to the places where the best opportunities are. And this is not only because of any tax holidays or tax exemptions. They can, for a short while, convince a company to go somewhere, but on the long run, you have to convince with not only economic data, but also with your specific advantages in particular sectors where you can develop a story around. In Georgia, I might think this can be in tourism, this can be, if you're talking about investment, this can be maybe in the wine sector, this can be in other areas I'm not completely overlooking, but develop a story around the advantages you think you can convey to European to German companies.
Thank you. Some more questions? I will use once again my role as a moderator, and I will ask privilege question regarding, and I really like the concept that you put on the weaponizing the legal order, and I think this is a general trend which hasn't been started recently, because we've seen how Russia quite successfully tried to weaponize its size, its role in international order, its veto power in the UN National Security Council, the UN Security Council, the OSCE. In a smaller scale, we've seen weaponization of economic sanctions with regard to Georgia in 2006 when Russia imposed embargo, energy embargo, trade embargo, because of the political considerations and for the achieving particular political goals. The same happened with regard to Ukraine, Poland as well, who at that time was EU and NATO member country. So this trend of weaponization, and as you said, it will be hard to reverse and to get back to where we were even some years ago. So looking, instead of us victimizing ourselves now, being on the margins of the Europe and not being able to be competitive, how you would foresee in the future the role of the small countries who are not competitive right now, but with the process of integration into the Europe, what role they could play in terms of stabilizing general overall security environment? And as you mentioned, you cannot view the economy isolated from the other processes in the region, like the challenges we have as a hybrid nature coming from Russia. The same should be applying from the Western civilized world. So economy, politics, military, all this should be part of the coherent strategy. And where you could see the role of the Georgia and small countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, in terms of playing a role as a stabilizing factor instead of being a factor of the controversy.
Well, I hope hope that in the end this will prevail and that definitely smaller countries also can play this important role. But to come back to what you said in the beginning, I think I want to differentiate because, as I said also, I think in my second or third finding, the Russians use economic sanctions to impose their zones and their areas of influence, which I would try to differentiate, but this may be a Western view on it, from the way and the reason why the West is weaponizing the legal system and is imposing sanctions because they think that a specific country is not complying to, again, agreed upon the Western values or the values of the international organizations they all agreed upon. But I agree that maybe even in Georgia, but definitely in Russia, one would have to one would definitely discuss about why this one kind of sanctions are different to other kind of economic sanctions. In the case of Georgia, I understand your question, because as you said yourself, the Russians were imposing economic sanctions on trade, on energy supply, definitely to increase their zone of influence and not to keep up any values. But again, for them, the zone of influence might be a value. What kind of role could these smaller countries play? I mean, this is something you could definitely learn from within the EU. There are a lot of smaller countries, and you may not realize that, but even sometimes the most important, but a lot of heads, presidents, chairmen in European institutions come from the smaller countries, because on the one hand that is most easiest to agree upon between the bigger countries, and second, maybe because they are so much dependent on international and European relations, they have a better European view on these issues. What do I want to say with that with regard to Georgia and Moldova and even Ukraine? If ever in the end there is whatever kind of integration into the European system, into the European Union, I think an additional particular view of a smaller country, a stabilized, economically, politically stabilized country, on be it the region it's coming from, but also on the bigger picture, helps diversifying the view of Europe on specific issues, and might definitely help to better understand how this individual country thinks and how things work within the respective regions. Let me just fantasize and let's presume that Georgia becomes a member of the EU, then definitely the view of Georgia on the South Caucasus as a region, as an economic region, as a region with regard to the cultural developments, as a region also on the security aspects, would definitely be helpful and would definitely lead to better understanding of the whole Europe on how this region works from within and also in relation to its neighbors and particularly in relation to Russia. So I think this will definitely lead to a more diversified and for me in the end and also a more successful policy of the EU as such. That's a long perspective.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation and very sharp and to the point answers to the questions, which I presume are not easy questions, but that are the questions that most of Georgians are bothered and they are interested to hear. I agree with Mr. David Sekharovidze. It would be great to see some kind of an op-ed or short synopsis of a few points that you mentioned for the wider public consumption. And as we see, the processes in the world are quite accelerated, so sometimes some event that seems quite distant could happen in much shorter period of time. At least we have to hope, but besides hope, we have to work toward this, and your words of encouraging Georgia to be competitive, I think, is the path where Georgia can shortcut its way to the Europe. So with this, I would like to ask Mr. David Ambrasidze for a few closing remarks before we finish our event.
Well, thank you, Batu. Thank you first of all to Atlantic Council for organizing this event. But I also like to use and come back to Konrad Adenauer Foundation mentioned in the beginning. I said that the Adenauer Foundation is a big friend of our university because we organize several events together, and I hope that will continue. And I'm pretty sure that we will have also quite interesting discussions together with Atlantic Council, with Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I hope that interest towards our university from inside, from student side, from academic part of it, but also from the civil society will grow and will definitely profit from this. Thank you very much for coming, for having this interesting discussion, and once more I would underline that today starts Georgian-German Strategic Forum, which became already a tradition, and I wish a big success to this already fourth annual meeting of the German and Georgian representatives.
Okay, just one very last remark from my side. I would have loved to see some more questions directly from the students, but maybe this works out then for the next time. Thank you very much.